Hello, welcome back. This is Jennifer, and I am very excited today because I have a guest artist who is sharing a gorgeous, simple yet stunning embossing folder technique. Michelle Short is one of the top clean and simple card makers out there. I'm a big fan of hers. She's going to give you tips on ink blending, using embossing folders, and even a great tip on stacking die cuts that I had never tried and will definitely try now. But before we jump into her cards, I wanted to give you a little heads up on two things. First of all, it's still STAMPtember over at Simon Says Stamp, and they have a different collab stamp set each day with a different company. And today is Altenew, ironically, because today's video here uses Altenew products. Even though we don't use this stamp set today, I just wanted to give you the heads up because it's a lovely set. I really like those sentiments, and I know it'll be gone soon, and they don't restock it. Also, there is an amazing Crafty benefit auction going on right now on Instagram that you got to check out. There are over 250 Crafty items up for bid. And these include items from many of your favorite crafters, including Tim Holtz, Gina K Designs, Christina Warner, lots of people, and some great crafty goodies from your favorite companies, such as Altenew. So I will put a link below. This is a benefit auction for a fellow crafter named Tina who is battling breast cancer. Even if you don't plan to bid, I encourage you to go and look at everything that's going on in the auction because it is very inspiring to see this crafty community come together. So I'll put a link for that Instagram account below, and I have several things up for auction in there too. Okay, now let's get started with Michelle's technique. I think you're going to love it.
Hello there, Michelle Short here, and I'm both honoured and delighted to be a guest here on Jennifer McGuire's channel. Today I'm sharing how to enhance dry embossing using products from Altenew. So let's get started. I'm starting off with a panel of Neenah £110 solar white cardstock that's cut to 3.5 inches by 4 3/4 inches. And I'm placing that down on the Altenew low tack sticky mat. This is the sticky mat that comes with the stamp wheel, but you can also purchase it separately. And I'm going to add some ink blending on top, so that's why I'm using the sticky mat to hold the cardstock in place. I'm taking the Dewdrops Fresh Dye Ink collection, and I wasn't sure at first whether I would use all 4 shades, but I decided to just use the 3 darkest shades. I'm just turning the mat slightly. I like to ink blend with my right hand, and I also like to generally come in from the right hand side, so I prefer just having my cardstock orientated this way whilst I'm doing the ink blending. I'm taking a large ink blending tool. I'm covering a large area here, so I want to use quite a large brush. This is going to speed up the process a little bit in terms of adding the ink on top, but also I want to add quite a lot of ink to this. I found that with this technique, I prefer having a darker saturation of colour on my cardstock. You can start off with coloured cardstock and that would work really well, and I have done that in the past, but actually I quite like having the gradient of the inks underneath. So I'm starting off with the lightest shade here, Aqualicious, and I'm just adding that towards the top. I am going over this multiple times so that I can get a really nice smooth blend of that ink, but these inks as they dry they do kind of smooth out a little bit, so don't worry too much about the actual process of ink blending. I'm now taking the middle shade, which is Teal Cave, and I'm bringing in a piece of scrap paper here just to blot off the excess ink off of the brush. Now really I don't really need to do this, but I've kind of got in the habit of doing it. I do in general find that I get a slightly smoother blend by doing it that way, but because I'm adding so much ink onto this panel, I don't really need to do it. You can absolutely use the lid of the ink pad. The only thing is, I have a thing of I really like all of my products to be as clean as possible. So for me, having ink on the inside of the lid of the ink pad is just not something I'm comfortable doing. So that's why I prefer to use a scrap piece of paper. But I do find just by dabbing off the excess ink, I do get a slightly smoother blend. So I'm just adding quite a lot of layers of this ink here, trying to blend it up towards that lighter colour. And then I can go in with the darkest shade, which is Galactic Stream. And I've just turned my cardstock here, the matte and the cardstock, so again that I can ink blend from the right hand side. So just loading up that brush, and again I am dabbing off the excess, but because I'm adding so much onto this panel I don't really need to, but like I say, it's become a little bit of a habit of mine. So I'm just going in with that darkest shade there towards the bottom, adding quite a lot of layers again so I can get the saturation of colour that I want. I do want the bottom to be quite a lot darker than the top. I really love the ombre look, but you could definitely go in with lots of different shades of colours here if you wanted to, like maybe sort of like a yellow, an orange and a red, or even like pink, green, blue. Anything you wanted would, I think, work really nicely for this technique. So I have removed that from the sticky mat, and I want to add the dry embossing onto this panel before that ink dries. So I'm taking the Bold Bouquet 3D embossing folder. This is a new one from Altenew and it's so very pretty. I really love those florals. I've placed it inside the front of the embossing folder here so that I can see where the image is going to emboss before I run that through my die cutting machine. Now I'm not going to lie, this took me quite some time to figure out the placement of this image. I wanted there to be some areas overlapping the sides of the panel. I just happen to really like that look. Kind of makes it look like it's a larger image than you actually have on your card. But I also wanted there to be some areas where there was no dry embossing at all. Any die cutting machine will work for these embossing folders. I'm using the Spellbinders Platinum 6 today. I've got the platform base at the bottom, followed by a shim. Then the cardstock inside of that embossing folder, followed by the adapter plate on top, and I'm just running that through the Platinum 6. The reason I want to do this quite early on is so that the ink hasn't completely dried. That's just going to add some moisture to the cardstock. It's going to help prevent any cracking off of that cardstock, and also just helps to have that embossing a little bit deeper than it would be if that ink was dry. And you can see here that that is just so pretty as is. For my next card, I wanted to change the shape of the panel. So I'm taking the Ornate nesting die set and I'm using the second largest here. And I've cut that again from a panel of Neenah £110 classic Crest Solar White cardstock and just popping that back on the sticky mat. This time I'm going to use the Blue Mountains Fresh Dye Ink collection. I absolutely love these colours. They're kind of more of like a purpley toned blue. I just think they're beautiful. And I'm using the 3 darkest shades again. I do find with this technique that I personally prefer having slightly darker shades on the panel. When I add the white pigment ink on top, it just means that the white pigment ink is going to kind of pop against the colours on the base. But you can definitely try this with light colours as well. I do think it works. I just don't think you get as much of an impact. So I'm adding the lightest shade here at the top. This is Alpine Aster. Using that large ink blending brush again. Really making sure to layer those inks up. And then I'm going in with Crystal Violet for the middle shade. And you can see here that it's really not very neat at all, but when I add the darkest shade on the bottom, it's going to kind of cover up that area. So this last colour here is Indigo Skies, and once these inks dry, they do dry out smoother, so any imperfections with the ink blending is not going to show. For this card, I'm using the Dreamy Daylilies 3D embossing folder. It's definitely one of my favourites. I'm placing the panel inside of the folder, and this time it's pretty much just going to go kind of like straight up and down. I quite like how that looks on the panel. Again, I'm going to run that through my die cutting machine. And again, I'm doing that fairly quickly after the ink blending so that that cardstock still has some moisture to it. And then I can just remove that at the other end. And again, this just looks so pretty as is, but I do want to enhance that embossing a little bit. So I've added the first panel back onto that sticky mat, and I've got Cloud White pigment ink here, and I'm just going to dab some of that onto the mat. I'm doing this rather than adding the ink blending tool into the ink pad in case I get any ink transfer, and I don't want to end up with any blue ink into that white pigment ink pad. I'm then taking a foam ink blending tool. I prefer to have something with a flat edge so that when I add the ink blending on top, this white pigment ink, it's only going to grab the areas that are the highest on the embossing folder. If I was to use a brush or something like that, I would end up getting the bristles and the white pigment ink into all of those nooks and crannies, which is not what I'm going for today. I just want to really highlight the top areas of that embossing. So the great thing with these 3D embossing folders is that they really are 3D. So you've got some high areas, some middle areas, some lower areas, and then areas without embossing at all. So this ink is really kind of just grabbing those top and middle areas. So you've still got some dimension on that embossing because not all of it is going to get completely covered up by this white ink. The reason that I'm doing this is just so that it kind of pops that embossing out a little bit more from the background. And you can see on the areas that I haven't covered that white ink just yet, you can really see the difference between the two. I do really like adding this white ink on top of the embossing. I think it just makes it pop out from the panel. You can add as little or as much as you want of this white pigment ink. I tend to go for kind of like a middle ground really. I do like to cover all of the areas, but I don't want it too stark white. I do sometimes like to dab a little bit of the ink on top. Kind of adds to kind of like a velvety look to the panel. If I get any ink on the outside areas where there's no embossing, I tend to just go over that a little bit with my finger and it tends to sort of blend into the ink. So I'm just going to do the same thing here for the other panel, and you can see when I add this ink on top, because those colours are even darker than the first panel, it's really going to pop out that embossing. I just think it looks so pretty, and in actual fact you can definitely do this kind of like as a spotlight, so you could just have the white in some areas and leave some without it. For this card I decided to cover the entire embossing area, but I do think it looks quite nice just having maybe like that highlight in the middle. So I'm just going in here, adding some more of that white on top. I think I went a little bit more heavy-handed with the white on this one because I was loving how it was looking as I was adding it because of that colour being so dark in the background. I added a little bit extra white. So just trying to blend out a little bit of that white that I got over the side there. And like I said, it just adds to the look, to be honest with you. I didn't find that it was too much of a problem. And these lilies are just so very pretty. I then want to completely dry these panels. If I add embossing powder onto them as is, the embossing powder not only is going to stick to where I added all of that white pigment ink, it's actually going to stick to a lot of the background as well because those inks still haven't completely dried. So now the panels are dry, I'm taking embossing ink. This is a clear sticky ink so that when I add the embossing powder on top, it's going to stick to this ink. You could definitely leave the white pigment ink wet and then add the embossing powder to the white pigment ink, but it is pretty much going to cover the whole of the area that you've added that pigment ink. I personally prefer just to add areas of the embossing powder just to kind of look a little bit like gilding on top of the kind of very top areas of that embossing folder. So I'm just going in with a detailed blending brush here. I'm going to do this in two different ways. First I'm using a brush, and then second I'm going to use my finger. And you can see that actually you do get a slightly different look by doing it in different ways. But I know that not everyone likes to get their fingers inky, and particularly for me, I'm not always a fan of doing that, but I do think I got a slightly better look by doing it with my finger. Because I'm using the brush here, I can't really tell, because it's clear ink, how much I'm actually adding on top, but you'll see that when I add the embossing powder, you can remove quite a lot of the embossing powder if you want to. So this technique is very forgiving at each point of this kind of technique here. So just going through all of that embossing ink there. And then I'm taking antique silver crisp embossing powder, and I'm just going over the entire panel with that embossing powder, and you can see that where I added that embossing ink, the powder has stuck to it, but there are some areas where it's a little bit too much for me, so I'm going to go in with a dry brush and just kind of dab over those areas. I do then use the paintbrush to kind of press the side of the cardstock to kind of flick the extra embossing powder off, and I also go along with that brush as well just to remove any excess where I don't want it. And like I said, I'm going for more of kind of like a gilded look, so I want the embossing powder to be kind of like a little bit speckly, if that makes sense, and so I don't want it to be sort of solid, and so that's why I like bringing in the brush so that I can remove some of that powder where I don't want it. So I'm just going to go through the entire panel here, and then I can bring in my heat tool to heat set that powder. And I never tire of looking at embossing powder melting. I just think it's so pretty, and it really pops against those colours in the background as well, I think. So I'm just heat setting this powder, and I do remove the heat tool so that I'm not overheating any of this panel. So I can just go through all of those areas there and just heat up all of that powder. And when it hits the light, I just think it's so very pretty. But I wanted to show you a different way that you can add the ink, and that's with a finger. So I'm just using my little finger here, and again I'm just going over the kind of highlights in the image where that embossing is the most raised, and where I think it would look quite nice having some embossing powder, some kind of like metallic look to it. The good thing about using my finger is I can feel how much ink I'm actually putting down. I couldn't do that with the brush, but I did end up getting a little bit of excess ink where I didn't want it. I don't want to say heavy-handed because I'm trying to go as light as possible, but even with a tiny little finger, I still managed to get a little bit too much ink where I didn't want it in certain places, but actually it gave me a little bit more of a stippled look, which is what I was going for. So this time I'm adding antique gold crisp embossing powder, and then I'm going to use this same brush here and just dab off any excess powder where I don't want it. So I can just remove all of that powder, making sure that there's kind of no powder in the areas where there's no embossing at all. And then I can bring in my heat tool again and heat that powder. And as it heats up, I just love the look of this. I think it's really pretty. It's definitely more of an organic look. I am more of a clean and simple crafter. I do prefer the look of clean and simple cards, but even for me with this, I think it's still a clean and simple look because I'm just adding it in a few areas. But it is more of an organic look, I think. So just heating up the rest of that powder there, and I think the gold really pops against those blues. For the sentiment, I'm using the Versatile Greetings die set. Again, this is one of my favourites, and I'm using the Thanks and the Hugs word. These come with shadow pieces. I'm not using those today, but I really love that they do come with the shadows as well. I'm going to die cut those from brushed silver and brushed gold metallic cardstock from Altenew. I'm just placing those down, holding them down with some low tack tape, and then I'm going to run those through my die cutting machine. And ordinarily I tend to go with either white or black sentiments, but I really love how these coordinate with that embossing powder. I've then cut the same die another 3 times from white cardstock so that I can stack those one on top of each other to create some dimension. I like to keep one of the die cut words into the negative portion of the cardstock so that I can layer the others on top of it. I find this a really good way to make sure that I don't distort the sentiment. I find sometimes when I'm taking the sentiment out of the die that sometimes those small areas between the letters can distort a little bit, and so sometimes when I'm kind of stacking them on top of each other, I'm not quite sure of the orientation of how they were supposed to be. So if I'm keeping it in the negative place, it's going to make sure that that is how it was intended to be. So that's 3 layers of the white cardstock, and then I've got that gold one on top, and I'm just going to remove the kind of outside edge rather than the word itself, but it has got quite a lot of stability at this point because it is 4 layers high. So I can just pop out the center off of that G there, and I've got a really nice dimensional sentiment to add on to my card. And I just did the same thing with that silver thanks word. I'm adding some instant dimension foam tape onto the back of the panels here, and I do really like to cover the panels very well with the foam tape. You could use scrap cardstock here to add the dimension if you didn't want to use foam tape. I'm placing the panels down onto A2 size white card bases, so that's a finished size of 4¼ inches by 5½ inches, and I like to just kind of hover the panel on top and stick that down before I actually kind of press anything down. Once I'm happy with those, I can add some liquid glue onto the back of the words. So just adding some onto the thanks word here. I'm going to bring in my T-square ruler so that I can try and adhere this on straight. And I'm just focusing that sentiment towards the top of the card. So just using some tweezers here to help me out with the placement. And then I can pop that down. Just trying to straighten that as best as possible. And then I'm going to grab something heavy to hold it down while the glue dries. I have then stamped an accompanying sentiment from the Sincere Sentiments stamp set, and I have heat embossed that with the same silver embossing powder. And I want to adhere this onto the card with a little bit of dimension, but I don't want to use foam tape. I didn't want it to be that high. So I'm taking some scrap pieces of white cardstock, just cutting those down into smaller strips so that I can adhere those onto the back of this strip. And that's just going to add a little bit of dimension onto the back of that sentiment. I can add some liquid glue onto the back of that, and then I can pop that down underneath the thanks word. And I really love how those teals work with the silver embossing powder. And then I've just done the same thing here with the gold hugs word. And I can just pop that down onto the card. And I'm not necessarily using the T-square ruler here to make sure that it's straight as such. I'm more just using it as a guide. So I'm just popping that down towards the left-hand side of the card. And then for this card, I wanted to add a little bit of embellishment because it's just the word on its own. I wanted to add a little bit of extra around it. So I'm taking some antique gold sequins and I'm just going to place 3 around the sentiment. I do like adding embellishments around sentiments. I think it just draws your eye into the sentiment. For me, the sentiment is kind of like the focal point, and those lilies are really the background of this card rather than the focal point itself. And so that's the cards finished for today. I really like how the embossing powder enhances the dry embossed images, and like I say, you can do this technique in lots of different ways, so I hope I've inspired you to give it a try. A big thank you goes to Jennifer for having me as a guest, and thank you for watching.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I hope you all enjoyed seeing her clean and simple yet stunning embossing folder technique. I love some of the tips that she shared. If you want to see more from Michelle, I will link to her YouTube channel below. And at the end here, I'll link to a couple videos that I did using embossing folders if you're looking for more ideas. I thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you again soon and have a wonderful week.